Whenever I hear about the best games the DS had to offer, it's always the same set of games across the board. While I've already come across many of them, there's always been a few that I never had the chance to try out. Just recently, I did exactly that with The World Ends With You, which definitely didn't disappoint to say the least. So I thought, why not try another widely praised game I know nothing about, and to that end, my sights landed on Ghost Trick. Every time I hear people talk about this game, it's nothing but great things, some even placing it higher than anything else. I'll be honest, it set my expectations pretty high, and now having beaten it, I can absolutely say it deserves it. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and today I'll be talking about Ghost Trick. Coming from the same people behind Ace Attorney, Ghost Trick is a mystery puzzle game of sorts that is wholly unique in a wide variety of ways. Case in point, its gameplay, where in order to stop characters from getting murdered, you control a ghost that's capable of preventing the murder as it's taking place. Solely looking at the premise, it's already a pretty solid start, but where the game truly shines are the puzzles it deals out for each different scenario, because as a ghost, you're capable of manipulating specific objects around the murder scene, some puzzles being relatively simple and others requiring some serious planning to properly complete. Not to mention, all throughout that, you've got to also keep track of the passage of time. Thankfully, you can stop time by entering the ghost world, however, to truly change a scenario's outcome, many actions have to be done at certain times. Take it from me, that combined with the game's stellar soundtrack makes for some incredibly tense moments. Now, of course, that also means you can go through the game solving stuff purely through trial and error, but there's nothing more satisfying than getting it all right on your first try. And core gameplay aside, purely from a visual standpoint, Ghost Trick clearly stands out from the rest. Before I played it, the thought never crossed my mind that a DS game could have such consistently smooth animations like this. It's noticeable from the moment you start the game too, little details added to characters' movements, making them far more lifelike despite the limitations of the DS. I can only imagine how much time and effort it took to achieve that, though believe me, there's far more to this game than what I've shown thus far. While I can't show anything past the first chapter, as this is one of those games I'd recommend going in as blind as possible, the story is absolutely perfect. Due in part to all the endearing characters spread throughout the plot, it's pretty rare to find a story as engaging as Ghost Trick's, the mystery elements woven into every new chapter only escalating the further you get into it. Plus, with the lack of any padding or filler whatsoever, Ghost Trick is an incredibly concise game. The only downside with that is once you pick it up, you'll find it increasingly hard to put down, it only taking me around 2 days to complete. So what are you waiting for? If you haven't played Ghost Trick yet, you're missing out on one of the best DS games. Don't worry, by the way, if you don't have access to an actual copy of the game, you can easily play it on the big DS, as the touch controls in the game are nearly entirely optional. If you've trusted my recommendations before, then believe me, this game is one of a kind. And now, having said that, it's time to move on to the rest of the game, all-encompassing spoilers inbound. Throwing you right into the middle of things from the moment you press New Game, Ghost Trick opens on the main character collapsed on the ground dead, and while there's no saving the protagonist, unfolding before him is another murder, a disembodied voice telling him how to utilize ghost tricks in order to save the lady. But unfortunately, ghost tricks or not, her fate is sealed, the hired gun still killing her despite being thoroughly spooked by the ghost tricks. Though not all hope is lost, because along with your ability to manipulate specific objects, if the protagonist interacts with the bodies of the recently deceased, he can go back to exactly 4 minutes before their death. So with the core mechanic of the game now properly set up, Ghost Trick mainly cycles between two styles of puzzle solving, the fast-paced death prevention puzzles and the more relaxed puzzles that occur in between them. However, rather than the game putting you where you were 4 minutes before the death, upon rewinding time, it places you in the location where the corpse is going to be, meaning that along with preventing the death, you've got to also make sure you get there in time before it's too late. It may sound unforgiving, I know, but the game does provide a good bit of leeway, the option to restart from the beginning or a checkpoint almost always being made available. In turn, one smushing later, the protagonist manages to save the lady, it dawning on him that pretty much any memories of his life are gone, all the way down to his name, which considering the premise, gives the protagonist a pretty solid goal to pursue throughout the plot. Things won't be that easy though, unfortunately, since as Ray, the disembodied voice of the lamp from earlier tells him, spirits can only last until the dawn of the next day, meaning he's only got one night left before disappearing for good. It's a pretty solid setup all around, hooking you into the story before you even know it, and considering how little time he has, the ghost needs to get moving fast, the telephone in the lower section of the area spontaneously ringing as the man who hired the assassin checks in to see if the deed is done. Putting 2 and 2 together, the protagonist is already making considerable progress, the old man on the other end appearing to be the one who ordered his murder. Subsequently, as Ray lets him know that ghosts can use telephones to travel, the protagonist follows the call to the other end, landing in a posh room occupied by 2 supposed villains. At first, he doesn't really find out anything he didn't already suspect, respect, the two discussing how the red-headed woman has to be killed. But then, just as it seemed like things were going nowhere, it's shown that they actually know about his true identity, the ghost learning that its name is Sissel and that the woman's name is Lynn. A pretty big step towards the truth, all things considered, though before Sissel can find out anything else, the old man gets called by a new assassin, this one apparently waiting in Lynn's apartment to kill her when she gets back. Thus, to save his only lead on his true identity, Sissel doesn't waste any time, the next segment of the game introducing the most important character in the entire story. In this new crime scene, it seems things have already taken a turn for the worse, the assassin having already tied up a little girl in the apartment and killed her dog. It's a pretty grave situation to stumble in on, the poor Pomeranian's demise providing Sissel with an opening to turn back time. As opposed to Sissel's inability to remember his identity, the dog manages to do so almost immediately, introducing himself as Missile and panicking upon seeing his owner Camilla tied up by the assassin. Compared to how straightforward the first scenario was, this one raises the challenge a fair bit, introducing events that if you don't trigger them at the exact right time, prevent you from progressing any further. I'll admit, it definitely took me a few tries to wrap my head around this one, but after some tactical rat abuse, Sissel manages to get Missile and Camilla out of sight when the assassin walks in. It's a better situation compared to before, no doubt about that, though things are still tense. Luckily, upon receiving a call from that old man letting him know that Lynn is still at the junkyard, he leaves to finish her off there, sparing Missile another trip to the afterlife. Then, when it seems like he's going back to where he started, Sissel now has the ability to talk to Missile, it appearing that he can do this to spirits who become conscious before getting revived. So going back to the junkyard, a criminal investigation has already begun on Sissel's death, Lynn's unfortunate presence at the scene of the crime and not making things look too good for her alibi. And while Missile may be the most important character in the game for reasons I can't go into right now, at this point one of my absolute favorite characters shows up, a groovy detective named Cabanela. Honestly, I feel like he exists purely so that the devs could show off their animation prowess, and I kinda love it. For a game with such a dark premise as Ghost Trick, aspects like Cabanela striking a pose merely to pick up a phone are what balance the tone out from being overly dark. I don't think I've ever seen a walk cycle that perfect. But I digress. After learning that Lynn is the suspect for his murder and that he'd been shot, the game once again doesn't give him much time to think on things as another gunshot rings through the junkyard. And just like before, it seems like Lynn can't catch a break with that sniper managing to offer. Although, unlike before, this time Lynn's spirit is conscious, her theme in particular being one I always looked forward to hearing. So after confusing Sissel a fair amount, he learns that she still doesn't seem to remember who he was, the only new information brought to the table being that Sissel had actually invited her to the junkyard. In turn, despite her openly telling him that she won't be able to help him discover his true identity, Sissel decides to save her regardless, this scenario continuing the trend of raising the challenge. To stop Lynn from dying this time, you have to plan ahead and turn on lights to coerce the assassin into a certain spot, except in order to do so, you have to keep in mind that out of the 3 lights, only 2 can be on at any given time, meaning that you have to turn them on and off in a specific order to succeed. Not to mention, to even get to that point, you've got to make sure your timing is precise, because if you miss a small window of time to hop inside Cabanela's bicycle, you'll have to restart. Overall, it's another thoroughly solid one, and with that, Lynn's life is saved yet again. Going back to the present, Lynn must have slipped past the cops, as Sissel doesn't find her where she was before. What he does find, however, following a top-tier dialogue chain, is a new location to go to, seemingly appearing to be inside a prison. Throughout Ghost Trick, pretty much all of its characters are great, but I have to give special praise when it comes to these 2 prison guards, as even though they aren't all that important in the grand scheme of things, the devs still chose to give them a little dynamic where one is constantly messing with the other. The game would have still been great without it, but it's minute decisions like that which make me adore this game even more. I mean, how can you not get attached to these side characters when one is such a dance master? But back to the story, not too long after arriving there, Lynn calls one of the guards, granting Sissel a new access point and an opportunity to talk to Lynn. Or at least it seemed that way, since with how unlucky she's been thus far, that's just not on the cards, Lynn somehow dying a 3rd time. Compared to all the deaths until now, this one is more on the unique side due to Lynn technically not getting killed by a person. Instead, when she entered the basement of the junkyard superintendent's office, turning on the light set off a Rube Goldberg machine. It's definitely a bit more on the ridiculous side, but it should also be a breeze, right? After all, Sissel can only manipulate non-living objects, and no living person had anything to do with the machine. Well, for this one, the main challenge is working with Sissel's limited range of moving from object to object, it requiring more precise movements than before, as to stop this death, you've got to do everything you can until the last second. I've said it before, but if there's one thing this game is good at, it's creating tension. The relief of said tension being all the sweeter when you prevent at the death mere moments before it happens. Though moving on, now that Sissel has a chance to talk to Lynn, he learns that she's been trying to solve a case that was closed many years ago, Lynn believing that the culprit is innocent despite having been imprisoned for a long time. And so that the two can help each other out, Lynn asks Sissel to do her a pretty monumental favor and sneak into the prison. Once there, he's got to find out the schedule of that prisoner she's been trying to prove innocent, meaning the best guards ever are getting more screen time. Of note, before Sissel manages to see the prisoner's schedule, he learns some pretty interesting information about everyone there. Apparently, each prisoner inside committed a crime which concerns national secrecy, the one Lynn is trying to prove innocent being guilty of murdering his own wife. And as grim as that is, Sissel still has to find out his schedule, but when he reaches him, it turns out he has no schedule at all, which works out for Sissel considering he doesn't remember how to read. So with the information acquired, all that's left is to report back to Lynn, except right before he does, the prisoner finishes his painting of someone he didn't want to forget, that said personage being Sissel himself, introducing a whole new slew of questions. It won't be long until he learns more either, since before Sissel returns to Lynn, he's able to follow a call to the police headquarters. It's not a location he spends all that much time in, though while he's there, he manages to see some evidence that reveals Lynn was actually his killer all along. All things considered, it's a big twist that leaves Sissel pretty distraught, and as per usual, Ghost Trick doesn't let up, with some disaster happening at the restaurant Lynn had chosen for Camilla to meet her at. So upon arriving at what's apparently the only source of food in the city, Sissel is met with a gruesome sight, a police van lodged halfway into the restaurant and Lynn suffering a death most foul. I'm gonna lose all my subscribers for that one. When he reaches her, the two casually exchange information over Lynn's own dead body, Sissel confronting her about what he saw and Lynn insisting that she has no recollection of killing him at all. In terms of what she'd had Sissel find out though, the prisoner's lack of a schedule turns out to be way grimmer than it initially appeared, because going off of that, it means that prisoner was going to soon be executed. But before Sissel can go stop that death, he has to reverse this one. Considering that this time Lynn's death was mostly due to the death of someone else, this scenario introduces a whole new layer of death prevention when at the very last second before Lynn gets crushed, you've got to turn back time even further to before the van driver died. As it turns out, the police detective was spying on the restaurant Lynn was waiting in, two foreign agents also waiting inside as they were supposed to meet with someone. The issue is, after one of the foreign agents destroyed the bug that was planted in their food, its destruction sent a loud screech directly into that police detective's ears, knocking him out and causing him to crash. While there's a lot of other good ones later on, this scenario is probably one of my favorite ones of the game's first half. The multiple location switches, combined with the various actions you've got to take to keep the van from crashing, becoming fairly tense. Well, other than when you're messing with the undercover policewoman working at the chicken kitchen by making sure she plants the bug in the wrong chicken. And once you give the detective a front row seat to the chef's dulcet tones, Lynn's fourth death is prevented. Going back to Lynn as she gorges herself on chicken, it seems like she trusts Sissel more after all the times he saved her. In turn, to explain her true motive, she tells him why she's so determined to prove that prisoner innocent. Back when she was still a little kid, that prisoner, a guy named Jode, was a rookie detective alongside Cabanella, and while chasing an escaped convict, he saved Lynn's life after the convict took her hostage. Ever since that day, Detective Jode had always been Lynn's hero, his actions inspiring her to become the detective she is today. And to make matters worse, rather than the norm of prisoners being executed at dawn, Jode is scheduled for that very night, Lynn immediately sending Sissel out to try to stop it. When he gets there, it looks like he was too late yet again too, because after restoring power to the prison, Sissel finds out that through the electric chair exploding, Detective Jode met his end. Quick side note here, one thing I found particularly neat in this segment is to get to Jode's body, you've got to jump through tiny drops of water falling from the ceiling. Guess that's one way to train your precision skills for future segments. Anyway, starting the next death saving scenario, this one is pretty simple in retrospect, though in my initial playthrough it did take a decent amount of trial and error to figure it out, since through manipulating this long-headed fellow, Sissel is able to trigger the electric chair's explosion before anyone enters the execution room, saving Jode's life by proxy. Following that, the next segment is probably one of the hardest points of the game for me, because to safely get Jode out of prison, you've got to guide him up to the exit all the while avoiding armed guards patrolling the area. I swear, there were so many times where I got Jode inches away from escaping only to forget about a guard that had him in their line of sight. But admittedly, it was pretty funny getting one of the guards into an endless loop of walking up the stairs only to fall back down. Regardless, now that you've managed to break Jode out of prison, it seems his luck has just about run out, with Cabanella waiting for him outside. To make sure his spotless record remains that way, Cabanella plans to turn Jode in despite the two being former friends. Except before he gets the chance to do that, Sissel manages to talk to Jode, if only for a little bit. As he reveals to Sissel, Jode believes he should die not only because of the crime he was convicted with, but because way back when he saved Lin, he'd shot the convict, killing him instantly. So while he doesn't see any other alternative for himself, Joe doesn't leave Sissel empty-handed, guiding him to the Justice Minister's office after Cabanilla cinematically hands Joe a pocket watch. And like always, awaiting Sissel is a whole new batch of trouble. At first glance, the Justice Minister's office seems to thankfully be devoid of any corpses. Well, until Sissel enters the ghost world. I swear, if it isn't her dying, Lin just can't escape being surrounded by death in every possible way. Thus, going into this scenario, this is another more complex one, as to keep the Justice Minister from dying due to stress, you've got to somehow bring his medicine back to him. That has to be one of the most morbid deaths in the game. And through listening in on his call, there's a pretty good reason he reacted that way, because combined with his wife keeping his daughter away from him like we saw earlier on in the game, those same foreign agents from the chicken kitchen have kidnapped his daughter in order to have him execute Jode that very night. Subsequently, to save him, this scenario took a fair bit more trial and error than usual for me, certain actions having to be done in a specific order to knock his medicine back over to him. Hell, for this one in particular, you've got to prevent his death 2 times in a row, though with how many pills he just took, he may be in for a third in a few hours. Back to the present, Lin is continuously insisting that Jode's execution be put off as she has new evidence that points towards his innocence, but sadly, the Justice Minister doesn't budge, mainly due to the kidnapping. Except upon going to the dilapidated house where the agents called them from, Sissel finds out they kidnapped Camilla instead. Interestingly, alongside the house bearing the same Rube Goldberg machine as the one that killed Lin before, Camilla has a core now, meaning some other ghost saved her at some point that night. And through talking to Camilla, Sissel learns a lot, mainly that not only is Jode actually her father, but in a freak accident with the Rube Goldberg machine she made, her mother tragically died. Seeing the terrible position this put his daughter in, Jode decided to alter the crime scene to make it appear like he'd committed the murder, this revelation proving that Lin's assumptions have been right all along. Taking in all the information we've learned about him thus far, at this point Jode became one of the most compelling characters in the entire game for me, and he only gets better as time goes on. Although before Sissel can entirely stop Jode's execution, he's got to prove to the Justice Minister that his daughter is safe and sound, this taking Sissel back to the apartment where the Justice Minister's wife and daughter are at. Once he's there, through the power of even more excessive rat abuse, Sissel manages to get the daughter to talk to him, the only reason she couldn't in the first place being due to the wife disagreeing with the Justice Minister's decision to execute Jode. As a result, with Sissel piecing the minister's family back together, he's far more inclined to tell him what he knows. Most importantly, that the government has actually been aware of someone like Sissel for a while now, as in certain cases like those of the other inmates in the prison, some unknown power manipulated them into committing their crimes. Even the minister fell prey to this unknown entity at some point, the only reason Jode has been scheduled for execution being due to that same manipulator possessing him. According to the minister, the event remains hazy in his memory to this day, meaning that anyone who gets manipulated won't remember it easily or at all. This in particular is pretty significant, since thinking back to the death of Jode's wife, it could have been the manipulator who'd caused the Rube Goldberg machine to malfunction and kill her. In fact, maybe even Sissel's death could have been caused by this power, Lin's lack of memory concerning his death narrowing down the possibilities by a lot. Without a doubt, things are really starting to heat up, and if at this point you've become comfortable with the game's mechanics, it's about to throw in a whole new aspect. Leaving the minister and Jode to go to Lin, she's currently at the park where Camilla was kidnapped. Again, it seems like Lin avoided dying a 4th time, but the same can't be said for an unlucky environmental activist who somehow was crushed by a massive statue. So turning back time to do what he does best, it turns out the activist managed to witness Camilla's kidnapping right before his death, everything seeming safe until suddenly, right before it appeared like Camilla was going to be crushed by the statue, it spontaneously moved to the right, saving Camilla at the expense of the activist. Considering everything the game recently revealed, this whole situation may already lead Sissel directly to the manipulator, and when he interacts with the other ghost at the scene, it's none other than Missile again. You see, inspired by Sissel's actions, Missile chased after Camilla to protect her, when right before she died, he got run over by one of the agents. However, unlike Missile's first death, this time he miraculously gained the powers of the dead, turning back time to save Camilla. The problem is, while Missile can move over longer distances, the only thing he can really do is swap items that are the same shape, not move or actually interact with them like Sissel can. Though now that the two are together, with their powers combined, they might just be able to save both the activist and Camilla. This game really doesn't disappoint. With the addition of Missile, Ghost Trick's gameplay gets expanded by a lot, his length and swap ability forcing you to approach things even more thoroughly than before, most swappable items requiring Sissel to intervene first, the solution to this one requiring him to both keep the the activist occupied and get the football close enough to be swapped with the statue. You can tell the devs had fun animating this one. Thus, with the activist saved at the literal last second, that's another scenario completed, Missile choosing to remain a ghost this time around as he wants to protect Camilla. Truly a good dog for the ages. Unfortunately for him, the leaf he's inhabiting gets blown away, separating Missile and Sissel for now. Regardless, going back to the ever-escalating plot, things continue that way as the activist happened to be in the park on that fateful day 10 years ago, where in a massive turn of events, it's revealed that Jode actually hadn't shot the man who'd taken Lynn hostage. He was in reality killed by a meteor impact of all things. Honestly, one of my favorite things about Ghost Trick has to be the way its story unfolds. In retrospect, it reveals a lot of information in each chapter, it's just that in the way they reveal it, you can't really piece things together immediately, the mystery being sustained by all new questions getting introduced after every reveal. And following Lynn's acquisition of the music box Camilla had hid before being kidnapped, the game reveals even more, the music box actually containing the real gun that killed Jode's wife. His innocence all but confirmed now. With that, taking all the puzzle pieces the game has presented up until now, it's time to piece some of them together, Jode dropping some of the most crucial information in the entire game. Going in order here, remember how Jode said he felt tremendously guilty for taking that criminal's life? Well, now that we know he didn't, what's the real reason for his guilt? It's not really because he was going to shoot him, it's because before he did, he'd fired a warning shot, causing that criminal to panic and take such drastic action as taking a hostage. Granted, Jode was still a very new detective at the time and acted rashly due to inexperience, but he's never been able to shake the guilt. However, above all that, at this point, he reveals the criminal's true identity, the man being someone we've actually known since the start of the game, Sissel. Except it wasn't Sissel, at least in name, the man bearing all resemblances to the protagonist, yet also having a different identity. It's frankly been ages since a game hooked me quite like Ghost Trick did with this twist, it practically ensnaring me as from here on, I played the game to its end in one sitting. After all, who needs sleep when you're faced with a story this good? And from here on, the game simply doesn't stop, Cabanela calling the minister right after that reveal to demand Jode's execution just like the foreign agent had. Clearly something about his demands are pretty off too. Too bad you can't ask him directly, because upon tracing the call back to the junkyard superintendent's office, Cabanela is already dead, the murderer this time being the very man whose corpse we saw at the start of the game. No matter what angle you look at it from, it seems like Sissel's true identity may be something else entirely, but before he can figure that out, the funky detective needs saving. Revealed in the 4 minutes leading up to his death, there really was something off with Cabanela's demands, since they were all done as a hostage. In their brief conversation, the criminal is apparently very much alive despite what happened 10 years ago, or at least their spirit is, what with them not reacting to any damage done to the corpse and what looks like the powers of the dead. After all this time, it seems like we finally found that supposed manipulator, meaning that unlike the last scenario where Sissel gained an ally, in this scenario he gains an enemy, one that due to being a spirit is fully aware of any actions you take in front of him. Throughout Ghost Trick, there are a plethora of tense situations the game puts you in, though in my opinion, nothing tops the scenarios where you have to avoid the manipulator, because if he catches even one of your movements, that's it. He straight up looks directly at the camera and calls you out before killing that scenario's victim right then and there. It's pretty scary the first time it happens. So due to that, Sissel can't exactly save Cabanela as is, which in the end isn't that big of an issue because in the basement he finds the corpse of the superintendent. Much like Cabanela, he'd also been killed by the manipulator, meaning that on his own, Sissel still can't do much at all. That is, until at the very last second he reunites with Missile, his leaf conveniently floating in the sewers. Subsequently, through a few tactical swaps that you've got the time so that the objects both have the same shape, the superintendent is saved, Cabanela following suit when you swap the manipulator's bullet with a knit hat. Don't get me wrong, saving the superintendent took me a good couple of tries, but above every scenario in all of Ghost Trick, saving Cabanela was honestly the hardest one for me to solve, since to get the knit hat to where it can be swapped, you've got to only make movements in the brief moments when the manipulator is distracted, and even then, once I'd figured that out, you've got to be careful not to do too many movements, since the knit cap is only swappable when it's on the hanger, not when it's on the floor. It took me way too long to figure that last part out, although with those two saved, we're beginning to approach Ghost Trick's finale, only 2 chapters left to go through. For all intents and purposes, Sissel's mystery seems inches away from getting solved, the only place in the game left to go from here being the base of that villain introduced early on, which in a pretty impressive cutscene for the DS is in actuality inside a massive submarine. However, before we depart, there's a few important scenes left. Firstly, through questioning Cabanela, the full truth of the manipulator's background is revealed. Back when he was alive, he'd been brought into the police station for a crime he didn't commit, and while taking a statement, Cabanela put way too much pressure on him, soon leaving the room but making the fatal mistake of forgetting about his gun inside, the manipulator using said gun to escape. So in truth, the manipulator truly hadn't done anything wrong, at least not at first. It was a series of other people's mistakes that led to his fall from grace. Plus later on when Jode's wife was shot, contrary to how he's acted all game, it's revealed that Cabanela has actually been trying to prove Jode's innocence all along, the Rube Goldberg machine in the basement being a recreation in order to figure out how it happened. Taking everything into account, Cabanela's big info drop fills in most of the holes left in Ghost Trick's mystery, Lynn and Jode learning everything as well since they were listening outside the office. And at probably one of the most hype points in all of Ghost Trick, after Jode went through years of guilt and confusion, he regains his detective spirit, the superintendent giving him back his old coat. You know you've got a good game on your hands when even side characters get scenes this solid. In turn, with everyone ready to go, Lynn and Jode set off for the submarine, Sissel going there via phone, only to discover that Lynn somehow suffered a fifth death. Originally trying to rescue Camilla while Jode deals with the main villain, the manipulator had actually possessed Camilla ahead of time, it looking like he was going to shoot Lynn when something else caused her death. You see, among every ghost with the powers of the dead, the one thing they share is that their powers come from dying near that meteorite that fell 10 years ago, whether it be the full thing or just a fragment of it. All along, the main villain's goal was to merely acquire the piece that had been lodged inside of the manipulator, the submarine being left to sink after he got a hold of it. At this point of the game, it really feels like the devs were just trying to see how far they could push these death-saving scenarios, because for this one, while the previous scenario remains the hardest for me, it goes above and beyond by having you disable a torpedo from within. As a fan of anything over the top, I loved it. It doesn't stop either, since following that, you've got to help Lynn and Camilla escape the submarine while it sinks, the addition of missile mechanics only improving the puzzle solving. Too bad the door at the top of the area is jammed, all of Sissel and Missile's efforts appearing for naught when all of a sudden a strange claw saves them, giving both the characters and the player a breather after that last sequence of non-stop puzzle solving. Lynn and Camilla's savior is actually the manipulator, inhabiting random scrap as he doesn't have his body. Seeing this and taking in everything that's happened so far, Sissel loses his internal image at this point, his search for himself going back to square one despite how close he is to finding out. Though don't worry, using the spare torpedo left in the submarine, all the ghosts manage to reach the control room housing Jode in the manipulator's body. Then combined with the info dump in the sub, this is where the manipulator's true nature is properly explained. 10 years ago, the manipulator, a man named Yamiel, was a suspect for a crime he didn't commit, it all leading to his death like we all know. However, because he died next to a fragment of the meteorite, its radiation had two effects. First, like we learned recently, it gave his spirit the powers of the dead and an eternal existence. The main difference with Yamiel specifically is due to the fragment getting lodged within his body, its radiation caused his corpse to be stuck in a perpetual cycle between life and death. To put it simply, just like we've done all game, Yamiel's body was forever stuck in the last 4 minutes of his life, effectively making it invincible. But contrary to what Ray told Sissel at the start of the game, Yamiel didn't disappear the morning after dying. His spirit just kept existing in a world unaware of his existence. At first, even his powers of the dead weren't much, the powers growing stronger with every passing year. In that time spent in his never-ending hell, it began to twist him, the anger from being falsely accused combined with the unbearable loneliness driving him to become a shadow of his former self, Jode's wife Alma being his first victim as he sought to make Jode feel the pain he felt. Then, in an attempt to regain his life in some semblance of a way, Yamiel struck a deal with that foreign nation who'd wanted his powers, the deal consisting of him handing over the meteorite fragment in exchange for a new identity and a body he could inhabit to live out the rest of his life that was stolen from him. Of course, before that, his drive for revenge remained overwhelming, the events of the very beginning of the game getting explained. Basically, Yamiel invited Lynn to the junkyard in order to then possess her and make it look like she killed him, confirming earlier suspicions. However, at the end of everything, the foreign nation double-crossed him, taking the fragment for themselves and leaving Yamiel's spirit to be trapped in the sunken submarine forever. In a game centered around multiple people dying, Ghost Trick somehow manages to make Yamiel one of the most tragic characters of them all. He's definitely one of my favorite antagonists in recent memory, but in going through with their betrayal, the foreign nation had made one fatal mistake. Before they stole the fragment, Yamiel's corpse had been in between life and death, meaning that with its removal, Sissel and friends can go all the way back to the death that kickstarted everything. Commencing the finale that's been built up for practically the entire game, the payoff is absolutely worth it. On one hand, I will say this final scenario isn't the hardest one in the game, but on the other hand, it's without a doubt the coolest. Every ghost utilizing their abilities to keep Yamiel from dying again. And even after you prevent the meteorite from hitting him, the scenario doesn't end that easily, the fragment instead striking Jode's leg and the rookie detective shooting Yamiel through the pain, which would be a pretty serious problem if not for a certain little determined Pomeranian who swaps the bullet with a sweet potato, saving Yamiel's life but still impaling his back with a spike. Finally, Yamiel saved for good, though due to the impact of him getting thrown back into the pillar, the statue on top begins to fall, nearly dooming Lynn to another death if not for the cooperation of all three ghosts, Yamiel stepping in at the very last second to save Lynn through controlling his own unconscious body. Maybe this is only me, but that whole segment at the end had me literally at the edge of my seat. It's crazy how much this game manages to fit into the last 3 seconds before a death. And with that, Ghost Trick's final scenario is over, the only thing left in the game now being the plot's conclusion. In the aftermath of everything, each character's fate has been permanently changed, Yamiel not getting the greatest outcome, but what matters is that he's alive. Even the little kitten who showed up at the scene gained a new fate, getting taken in by Jode after Lynn finds it unconscious. The thing is, that kitten is actually one of the final puzzle pieces in the plot of the game, because after all this time, that kitten is Sissel's true identity. Confused? Well, don't worry, because it somehow makes perfect sense. Following Yamiel's original death, Sissel was his only friend for all those 10 years, the ghost taking care of the cat while he regained his memories. Once he got them all back, he didn't immediately pursue revenge either, since before all that, the thing that truly broke him was discovering that his fiancée had just died, Sissel getting named after her. Then, when he set up the trap for Lynn, she fought Yamiel's possession, the first shot that missed actually killing Sissel, who was inside a bag. You see, Yamiel brought Sissel there so that he could temporarily possess him to get away from the crime scene. They actually show this in the beginning of the game too, though there's no way of figuring it out. To his dismay, upon relinquishing control, he found out Sissel had died, and due to him dying next to Yamiel's corpse, he got the powers of the dead from the fragment still lodged inside it. You'd think that with Sissel and Missile both being able to rewind time to save the dead, that Yamiel could have just done that for Sissel or even his fiancée, but sadly his powers of the dead don't even let him do that. In turn, with Yamiel's death reversed, pretty much all the events of the game are nullified, the only remnants of them being the memories held by the spirits present for Yamiel's fate change. So that should be it, right? Pretty much every mystery the game presented has now been promptly solved. That is, all except for one, because right before Sissel goes to his new reality, a certain lamp reappears to thank him. It's Ray again, the first spirit Sissel originally met but never actually learned the true identity of. Well, let me tell you, compared to every monumental twist Ghost Trick has churned out, this final one blew me away. As he tells it, in a timeline where Lynn's life wasn't saved, all of Yamiel's plans went perfectly, meaning when that hitman went to Lynn's apartment, Yamiel accompanied him, Missile dying right next to him and gaining the powers of the dead. Initially, his powers were far too weak to revive someone or make any real difference, though going back to the junkyard as he'd heard Lynn died there, he stumbled upon Sissel, at this point recently dead and without his memories. Now thinking back to the start of the game, the main goal in Sissel's mind was to find his true identity, not much else, and since Missile didn't know that yet, he was unable to convince Sissel to help him, the cat abandoning him in the junkyard. Thus, with his overall lack of power, the only option open to Missile was to follow Yamiel to the submarine and turn back time to his death, waiting out the full 10 years in order to get a second chance at saving everyone. That's why in Ghost Trick's tutorial, Ray said things like how spirits can only last a day, or how Sissel's fate is linked to Lynn's, because all this time, he was actually Missile, who through deceiving Sissel, was able to set everything into motion. When I got to this part myself, I honestly had to sit there for a second just to process everything. What an incredible story. So while Sissel was able to go to the new reality, this Missile will be erased along with the old one. Like I said earlier, he really is the most important character in all of Ghost Trick. And with that, the ending Sissel has long fought for is finally realized, all the characters happily living out their days in the new timeline. Except for Sissel, things are a bit more different than the rest, because rather than Yamiel getting pierced by the fragment, the meteorite's victim switched to Sissel when he was just a kitten, effectively making Sissel immortal along with bestowing all the powers Yamiel originally had. It may be a bit bittersweet after learning about Missile's sacrifice, but following that, Ghost Trick cuts to credits, the game closing off in a more than satisfying way. As if I haven't gushed about this game enough, allow me to do it a bit more. This game has so many good qualities, a list of them would be multiple pages long. I mentioned it a good amount of times, but just take Sissel's true identity for example. Him being a cat isn't something they pulled out of thin air, contrary to what you might think. If you go back through the dialogue once you know everything, they actually hint at it multiple times, albeit in pretty subtle ways. For example, his inability to read the prison schedules. The game quietly sweeps it under the rug as just another aspect of his amnesia, though in reality, he could never read in the first place. That's not the only one either. There's the multiple points of him using or chasing rats, there's a small piece of dialogue where he admits to small spaces being comfortable for him, and when he's in the prison, he acts like he's never seen darkness before, which makes sense considering cats can see in the dark. You can tell that whoever wrote Ghost Trick's story did it with extreme attention to every single part of it. Hell, Sissel also prevents 9 deaths, conveniently aligning with cats having 9 lives. Frankly, it's pretty rare to see this kind of dedication when it comes to creating a game's story, and Sissel isn't the only aspect worthy of praise. Essentially every character, no matter how minor, has something unique about them, whether it be the dancing guard or the divorced detective. And that's just the characters. Another part of this game that made it so good for me was the variety in each different scenario. At least in my eyes, nothing ever got overused or became stale, each new puzzle presented to you standing out from the last one you solved. The music definitely helped a great deal too, those last few scenarios especially getting enhanced by the tense soundtrack that accompanied them. If there ever was a perfect game, Ghost Trick would be a prime example, it already standing alongside my other favorite titles as a near equal. The sad thing is, when it was released back in 2010, it didn't perform well at all. Its international release in 2011 also underperforming due in part to an overall lack of marketing. It's really such a shame on so many levels, because while I'd never want a direct sequel to Ghost Trick, what with its story wrapping up so neatly, another game utilizing the same mechanics but in a different story could have serious potential. I'll even settle for a Ghost Trick port beyond the mobile port it received. It's not like the game utilized the DS that much anyways, it could easily exist on the Switch or another modern console. And hey, maybe that way, now that the game is more well known, or at least I hope it is, it could get enough sales to garner another game like it. If anything, seeing how this came from the same people behind the Ace Attorney games, I really need to check those out sometime. I know practically nothing about them, so who knows, they may even be the subject of a video at some point in the future. Regardless, at the end of the day, Ghost Trick is a perfect combination of unique gameplay and an extremely engaging story. It may not have gotten the recognition it deserved back when it released, but like many works of art, over time it's become appreciated by an ever-growing amount of people. Some quick news before I thank my patrons. For those of you who watched my Omori video, I finally started uploading the VODs of my old Omori streams like I said I would. Do go over to my VOD channel if you want to check them out. Plus, for a big future project of mine, I'll be going through Metroid Fusion for the first time on my Twitch starting tomorrow. Let's just say, if you liked my Kirby lore video, there's more like it on the way. And now, to those who've continued to help out the channel, I'd like to give a heartfelt thank you to Ali Elman, Cognitive Dissonance, Jules Lee, and everyone else who've decided to contribute. You guys are the best. If you want to help me continue making unnecessarily long videos like these and receive a special thank you amongst a lot of other bonus stuff, do check out my Patreon, link in the description. Going through this game was really such a treat. Do tell me in the comments or over on my Twitter what other games like these you'd be interested in seeing me cover. I do currently have my next couple of videos planned out, but hey, I'm always open to suggestions if they'll lead me to wonderful games I know nothing about. And don't worry, for those who've already been suggesting titles, I've read your comments and replies. As I said, it won't happen for a bit due to my next few videos being set in stone, but there's another certain DS classic that's already on my radar. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.